Welcome to Game Fondue Reviews. In this video, we're going to take a look at Trois. Trois is a dice-based Euro set in the Champagne region of France. Let's jump right in with the description of the rules, see a few example turns being played, then I'll be back for some closing remarks. This is Trois, set up for a 3-player game. To set up, each player is going to pick a color, take all cubes and the 2 discs in that color. They're going to put one of the discs on one of the sections of the central board, and that's going to represent their district for the game. Then they're going to put the other disc on the 4 space of the influence track up here, and from there they're going to take a certain number of meeples based on the player count. In a 4-player game, each player is going to take 4 meeples. In a 3-player game, each player is going to take 5. And in a 2-player game, each player is going to take 6. And the rest are going to form a general supply over here, but you can see we're a 3-player game, so each player has taken 5. Aside from that, you're going to give each player 5 deniers, and the amount of deniers a player has is public information during this game. After that, you're going to shuffle the character cards and deal 1 face down to each player. The player that received it can look at it, but should not show it to any other players. Also want to put on a 2-player game, you're going to deal each player 2 character cards face down instead. After that, you're going to sort and shuffle the activity cards by color and round number, and then you're going to deal 1 face down to each indicated space on the board. So for instance, we would shuffle all the white 1s together and deal 1 to the white 1 space of the board. There's white, red, and yellow, and they're all laid out like so. And lastly, you're going to sort and shuffle the event cards by color and form a face-down stack of each. But from the red event deck only, you're going to remove some cards based on player count. If it's a 4-player game, you're only going to leave 6 cards in this deck. If it's a 3-player game, you're only going to leave 5 cards in this deck. And in a 2-player game, you're only going to leave 4 cards in that deck, because those also serve as the round markers. From there, you're just going to form a supply of neutral figures, victory points, deniers, and dice, and you're ready to start the game. The game begins with an initial placement phase where players are going to put their workers on the board. And then the main game is played over a certain number of rounds based on the player count. It's going to be the same number of rounds as cards in that red event deck. So with a 4-player game, it's going to be 6 rounds. A 3-player game, it's 5 rounds. And in a 2-player game, it's 4 rounds. Each round is composed of 6 phases, which are reveal activity cards, income and salaries, assemble workforce, resolve events, perform actions, and then the end of round phase. After the final round of the game, there is a final scoring where additional points are awarded for different things in the game, and at that point, whoever has the most points wins. The initial placement phase works slightly different in a 3- and 4-player game than in a 2-player game. The only difference is that in a 2-player game, you're going to start with some neutral citizens out on each of the corners of these buildings, like so. Then placement's going to resolve exactly the same way. However, in all cases, the initial placement phase only happens once at the beginning of the phase. It does not happen each round. So the way you start is you're going to pick a start player. In this case, it's the orange guy because he has the start player card. They're going to place one of their workers out on any available building spot. You can see each building has 6 available spots, so as long as nobody's there, you can place there. Then the next guy in clockwise order is going to go and do the same thing, then the next. But once you finish one round of placement, it's going to snake back. So in this case, the green guy would go second, then the blue player. But now the blue player would start the next round placing, and then it would go back to green and orange. And then it would snake back one more time. It's going to snake until all players have used all of their starting workers. And then once that happens, in a 3- or 4-player game, you're going to fill the remaining spots with neutral guys. Remember, in a 2-player game, you put the neutral guys out on the board first. When all building spaces are filled, the initial placement phase is complete, and you're going to move on to the main game, which is composed of those 6 phases we talked about. The first is revealing activity cards. You reveal all activity cards on the board matching the current round number. So for instance, in round 1, we're going to reveal all the level 1 activity cards. Now you'll note that there's only 3 activity cards and more rounds in the game, so in rounds 4 onward, we're not going to perform this step. The next phase is income and salaries, and at this time each player is going to receive 10 money, but they're going to have to pay money based on the location of their guys. For every guy they have in the red building, they have to pay $2, and for every guy they have in the white building, they have to pay $1. It can come from the 10 money they just received or from money they've already had earlier in the game, because remember, they start with 5. So for instance, if the blue guy had 2 guys here and 2 guys down here, he'd have to pay $2, $4, $5, $6, so he would just put that in the bank. Anybody that cannot pay the full amount they owe is going to pay as much as they can and then lose 2 victory points. And victory points will be in front of them, and they'll be kept face down during the game. But you can never go below 0, so if you can't pay early on, it will not affect you. Just to be clear, I also want to point out players do not have to pay any money for any workers they have in the yellow building at this time. With that, players are going to roll as many dice as indicated by the location of their workers. They're going to roll 1 die of a matching color for each worker located in each building. So for instance, the blue player would roll 1 yellow, 2 red, and 2 white. So they would do that at this time. They're going to put these results in their area. So for instance, we can see he's got these reds, whites, and yellow, and they're going to go in his blue section of the board. All players would do this simultaneously, and the first player will also roll for the neutral player, because he'll probably have some guys out here too, and those will go in the neutral players section of the board. After all players have rolled their dice and placed them in their districts, you're going to reveal the top red event card of the deck. It's always the red card, but it's going to tell you to add another card. So for instance, we can see here that this one wants us to also reveal a white card. And you're always going to put them in the first available space nearest marauding. Marauding is an event that's going to always be on the board. At this time, we're going to resolve the events in order from marauding this direction When an event resolves, you're going to do what it says on the bottom of the card. So, for instance, marauding is always going to resolve first. This is a permanent event that's going to always be on the board. When you see a black die, the first player is going to take that many black die to his hand. So for this one, he'll take 1. For this one, he'll take 2. And then for this one, all players will lose 2 influence. Also want to point out, if you ever cannot lose all of what you're supposed to lose for event cards, for instance, if you only had 1 influence to lose, you would lose as many as you can, then you would lose 2 victory points. But remember, you can never go below 0 in this game. So once all event effects resolve down the line, you're going to roll any black dice that you now have in your hand. So it would be 3 here, because we have 1, 2, 3. You're just going to put them in an unoccupied section of the board. First thing now is the players have to fight these black dice in player order, beginning with the start player. In this case, it would be orange. So let's pretend orange has some dice out in his board. For the sake of argument, let's just put 3 white and 2 red here. So when you're fighting black dice, you always have to fight the highest valued one. So the orange player is first. He has to fight this number 6 because it's the highest available one. But he can choose to fight additional ones if he would like to at that time. And the way you fight black dice is you have to discard dice from your area, can't be from anybody else's area, equal to or greater than the value of that die. So for instance, he could discard a 6 to fight this 6, and that would match it. However, red dice only during this phase are worth double. So this red 5 is actually worth 10 for purposes of fighting these. For this example, let's pretend the orange player decides to discard this 1 red 5. Now that's worth 10. He can choose to just destroy this die and leave the others for the other players, or he can add additional ones. This totals 7 here. He decides he's just going to take down both of them. So this die is returned to the supply, and he gets 1 influence per die he countered. So in this case, he would get 2 influence points at this time, and he would just advance on this track up here. Now the next player in clockwise order has to fight the next highest remaining one. There's only 1 left, so the green player would have to face this one here, and so on. Until all of the dice are countered, it's even possible some players get multiple turns if there's lots of black dice on event cards. The only thing to note here is if it's ever a player's turn to counter black dice and they cannot counter the highest remaining black die, remember they have to. So for instance, let's pretend there was a 5 and a 1, and for some reason it was the green player's turn and he could not counter this 5. Even though he could counter this 1, he can't choose to do so because he must counter the highest. But anyway, he would just take this off the board like he countered it and lose 2 victory points. And you can't do that by choice. That has to be something you're unable to counter. But after all black dice are countered, we're going to move on to the actions phase, beginning with the start player and then proceeding clockwise with each player taking 1 action or passing. The possible actions a player can take include activating an activity card, building the cathedral, using agriculture, placing a guy in a building, or combating events. Regardless of which action a player chooses to do, they're always going to use 1 to 3 dice of the same color to perform it. They can always take dice from their own region for free. So for instance, if the orange player wanted to use these 3 white dice, that would be totally free to him. But remember, he couldn't use 2 white and a red. You always have to use the same color. But you can also buy dice from other players' regions, including the neutral player. The cost depends on the amount of dice you're going to use in the group. Not the amount of dice you're buying, but the amount you're going to use in the group. So for instance, if this player decided to buy this white die here, but then use it with these 2, that would form a group of 3. And that's a different cost than buying the die by itself. If you just buy a die to use by itself, it's going to cost you 2 money. If you buy a die to use in a group of 2, it's going to cost you $4 per dice. And what I mean by that is if you buy this die here and this one here, it's actually going to cost you $8 because you're using them as a group of 2. But if you supply one of your own and you buy one, it's just going to be $4 because it's $4 per dice used in a group of 2. And then for a group of 3, it works the same way except it's $6 per dice. So right here, this would cost 18 while this would cost 6, for instance. It's also important to note when you buy dice from another player, you pay the money to that player. If you buy from the neutral player, you put your money in the bank. Before going into each possible action in detail, I do want to touch on how influence works in this game. It's shown on your player aid here, and this also shows the cost of buying different dice. But there's 3 different ways you can spend influence, and you can spend them at any time during your own turn, even right before you counter black die. So the first way is you can spend 1 influence, and you can re-roll any die in your own area. You can never use influence on other players' die. So for instance, if I wanted to re-roll this 5, I would lose 1 influence, and I would re-roll it like so. And as long as I had influence to spend, I could continue re-rolling the same dice or different dice at any time during my turn. Next thing I could do is at any time I can hire a guy by paying 2 influence. So I would just move my thing back 2 influence as normal, and I would take a guy from the general supply and put him in my area. You can do that whenever you'd like, but usually you're going to do it because you need the guy. And the last thing I can do is I can spend 4 influence and pick any 3 dice in my area, again, it can't be somebody else's area, and flip them over to the opposite side. So for instance, if I pick these 3 dice, and the 3 dice don't have to be the same color, I would flip them to the opposite face. Now normally that wouldn't be a great idea because these dice just became much smaller. However, you can also pick to flip 1 dice or 2 dice. It does not have to be a group of 3. So with that, let's move on to the actions. The first action a player can do is they can activate an activity card where they have a worker by discarding a group of 1 to 3 dice matching the color of the card. So if we wanted to use this card here, we can see it uses red dice. So we would need to use 1 to 3 red dice to use it. But again, you can only use a card where you have a guy. So if you don't have a guy on a card, you're going to have to pay to put one there to activate it. The actual action is activating the card, so you can't just pay to put a guy on and not use the card that turn. So for instance, if we wanted to put a guy here, it would cost 6 money, because that's the cost shown here. We're always going to put him on the leftmost available space. If all the spaces in the card are full, you're just going to put him on the illustration itself. Now, when you place a new guy, you can take him from anywhere on the board. So if it's the orange player's turn and he decides he wants to activate this card, he could just take his guy off here and put it on if he'd like, or he could spend influence to hire a new guy from the general supply for 2 and then put him on. That's what we're going to do. So he's going to spend 2 influence. He's going to pay 6 to put this guy on, because that's always the cost. So he would just put that in the bank. Then now he can take the action. So he can always use this dice for free because it's in his section, but if he wants to use these, he's going to have to spend money. If he just bought one, it would be $4, but he's going to buy both, so it's going to cost 6 each. So he's spending $12 to use this group of 3 dice. Any dice you use are just returned to the supply, but you're going to add up the total. This was a 6 before I did that, so that's 12, 17. We can see that on this die, you divide by 4, so it's going to be 17 divided by 4, which is 4, which means he's going to get to activate this card 4 times. Now, unfortunately for him, this card lets you put 1 cube on each of these events per red die you have in your area. So he actually doesn't have any red die, so he wouldn't get to do anything. But in the same example, if he left 1 red die here and bought these 2 for 8 for each, he could use this as 12, so that would activate 3 times. So he would get to put 3 cubes out on these different cards. So he could just lay 1 here, and maybe he wants to put another one on this same card. And that's how activating the cards work. There's 2 types of things. There's ones that activate immediately, which are these 2 here, and there's ones with an hourglass that have a delayed effect. Whenever you activate a card with an hourglass, you're going to put that many cubes on the card. So for instance, if instead he chose to activate this one up here, again, it would cost 6 to put a guy on it, and then he could use it. Let's say he had 12. So 12 divided by 3 is 4. So he would put 4 cubes on that card. Now he would just take them from his supply and put them here. Now what these cubes do is on a later group, he can take one off to use it. So for example, in this space, when you use a group of yellows, you can take one off to add 3 to the value of all 3 dice in that group. So he'd save them on there for now, but you can only ever use one of these per dice group you use during the game. So if he was to take this yellow, for instance, he couldn't use a whole bunch of these just to increase the value really high. He could use 1 per group. But these 4 cubes are going to stay there until he uses them, and you just use them by picking them off when you take later actions. The next possible action a player can do is they can build the cathedral, which is this area up here, and you always build the cathedral with a group of 1 to 3 white dice. So when you take the dice, you're going to build in that column matching the die number. So for instance, if he took these 2 6s to use as his action, he would build twice in the 6th column. You always build from the bottom to the top. So with the 2 6s, you would build here and here. Now if you took different dies, so for instance, let's say he took these 2 6 and he bought this 3 4 6, he would also place in the lowest available spot in the 3. Now whenever you place from 1 to 3, you're going to get 1 influence immediately and 1 victory point. So you would just move up on the track and take a victory point, keep it hidden in front of you so the other players don't know how many you have. But if you're going from 4 to 6, you immediately get 1 victory point as normal, but 2 influence. So in this example, the guy used a 3 and 2 6s, so he would get a total of 3 victory points and 5 influence. It's also important to note a player can never have over 20 influence at a time. 20 is the absolute max in this game, and if you continue to gain, you do not gain beyond that. Also, you can never build past the 3rd row here. So for instance, this guy, if he played a 6 now, he wouldn't be able to put one up there because it's totally full. Another possible action players can perform during their turn is to combat events. There are always event cards down here. In particular, marauding can never leave the board, so it's always in play. And as usual, you're going to take 1 to 3 dice of a matching color. Even though marauding has a whole bunch of different colors, you still can only fight it with dice of 1 color at one time. And then you're going to divide by the result indicated. So for instance, this one is fought by reds and divided by 2. So if this player used this 5 and maybe he had another 5 here, so that would be 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. He would get to place 5 cubes out on this. For every cube you place, you're going to immediately take 1 influence, and that's what this flag is there to remind you of. But when a card is totally full, you're going to score it. So let's pretend it ended up like this. Also, I want to point out, if you place earlier, you always want to place to the top left and downward, because sometimes that's used for breaking ties. So for instance, if blue placed the last one here, you can never place more than the last one. So even if blue had the turn here and he used 2 reds, for instance, and there was only 2 empty spots, the rest of the die values would be lost. He'd only get to place twice and gain the 2 influence. But anyway, once the card is totally full, you're going to score it. Whoever has the most cubes on it is going to get the higher value here, so we can see orange has the most, so he gets 2. And then the second place goes to whoever's in second place. Now we can see here there's a tie for second, so they would actually divide that value between them, so they would both end up with 0. No points for them. However, if there's ever a tie for first, you're going to add up the top value and the bottom value together. So in this case, it would be 3. So if green also had 3, for instance, and then we would divide between them and round down. So each of them would actually get 1 point in that case, and then there would be no second place awarded at that time. Also, in the event that one player fills the whole card, so if orange filled his whole card by himself, nobody else was involved, he would get 3 points. And some event cards actually put neutral things on them. Neutral do count towards scoring, so neutral could get the highest amount or the lowest. You don't actually give him any points, but he can block other people from getting them. So anyway, after a card is scored, whoever has the most cubes on it takes that card and puts it in front of them. In the event of a tie, for instance, we see here orange has 3 and green has 3. Orange would take it and put it in front of him because he actually placed on it first. Whenever an event card is taken from the group, so for instance, these guys would just be returning the supply, the cubes, back to their players. Orange player would take this, and any events here would just fill in any gaps created by that. Whenever marauding is scored, it scores normally, meaning that whoever has the most gets 2 and second most gets 1, and then all the cubes are going to be removed from it, but nobody gets to take it and put it in front of them. Marauding stays on the board, and people can continue to counter it, even the next action immediately after it was countered. The next possible action a player can do is they can use agriculture, and that's always done with a group of 1 to 3 yellow dice. So you would just take them and divide by 2, and that's how much money you get. So for instance, if this guy used these numbers here, and he decided to buy this one, that would be 7, 8, 9. That would cost him 6, because even though it's 1 die, it's used in a group of 3. 9 divided by 2 is 4, so you would just take 4 money at that time. The final possible action a player can take during their turn is they can place a new guy in a building. And unlike the other actions, this is always done with exactly 1 die. And the die color is going to match the color of the building. So for instance, you want to place a guy in yellow, you need to use a yellow dice. If you want to place a guy in red, it's red. And white, of course, would be white. So white and yellow work the same way. Red works slightly differently, but let's discuss how they work. Let's pretend there's a little bit more guys in here, like so. So when you place in white or yellow, you're going to place in the row corresponding to the die values. So for instance, if you use a 2 or 5 in yellow, you're going to place in the same spot. You're always placing right here. So if the orange guy used a 2 in yellow, for instance, he's going to place in this row with one of his guys. You might have to buy a new guy from the supply, but as usual, you can move anybody from anywhere, even off a card. So let's say he spends 2 influence to buy a new guy, and he's going to place him on this 2 spot right here. Now what happens is everybody's going to slide down, and this guy will just lay down on the building. Now this is significant because the same player can never lay down on the building twice. So for instance, if this player now on a later turn wanted to use a 3, which would be this column here, he would use the 3, but he cannot, because that would cause another green player to lay down on that building at the same time. So that would be an illegal move. But white works exactly the same way. 2, 4, and 6 push this row. 1, 3, and 5 push this row, but you always place on the farthest spot, so you're farthest from being pushed into there yourself. Multiple colors can be pushed into the place at one time though. So for instance, if another player later decided to use a 5, so let's say green used a 5, he pushes this guy down, and both blue and green can lay on it. But now nobody could push another blue or another green off at that time. And these guys can be used like any other person, so if somebody's activating a card, they could take them off and put them there. But then more of their guys could be pushed down. Now I mentioned red works differently. Red is a direct replacement, so it doesn't matter where you are. So for instance, even if there was an orange guy on this side where you would normally place here and then shift things down, if you used a 4 of red, you can see this space is the 4. That orange guy would just be knocked down, and whoever came in would just go right to that space. So that's how that works. The only other thing a player can do on their turn is they can pass. If a player passes when there's at least 1 die still left on the board, it can even be in the neutral players section. They're going to put 2 money in their area. So for instance, if orange passed under this situation when there was still dice all over the board, doesn't even have to be in his area, he would put 2 money in it. And then players would continue taking their turns. Once you pass, you can take no more turns. But every time it would be your turn, you're going to add 1 money to that group. The round continues like this until all players have passed, or there are no dice left in the area, in which case those players have automatically been considered to have passed. But they do not get the 2 money for doing so. At this time, everybody takes the money from their district to their area, so in this case, orange would just get the 3 money. Also, anybody they have laying on places, they get back to their personal supply. So they won't have to pay 2 influence to hire a new one. They're going to have another guy in their personal supply. So orange and blue would get these guys back, for instance. From there, you're just going to pass the start player card 1 place to the left, and you're going to do another round. Unless, of course, the game was over. You know the game is over when this pile runs out, because it should have the same number of cards as there are rounds in the game. After a certain number of rounds have ended, the game is over depending on the player count. Again, in a 4-player game, it's 6 rounds. In a 3-player game, it's 5. And in a 2-player game, it's 4 rounds. And at that time, a final scoring occurs. Players are going to get 1 victory point for each event card they have a cube on. And it's not number of cubes, it's number of event cards. So we can see here, orange has 2 cubes, but it's only on 1 event card, so we would get 1 victory point. Also, marauding counts here, so if this was the situation, orange would get 2 victory points. And this applies to all event cards in play for all players. Players also gain victory points based on where they are on activity cards. You can see here, this space was worth 2 victory points and this is 1. So players are going to gain all of those at this time. This guy, even though he's the only one here, is on the second space, so he would only gain the 2 points for that space as indicated, but you're going to total them and players are going to take victory points. Next, each player loses 2 points for every row they are not in. You only have to have 1 cube in each row to not lose these 2 points, however. To be clear, the rows are this direction, and we can clearly see the orange player does have at least 1 in each row, whereas no other player is on at all, so they would all lose 6 in this example. Finally, players are going to reveal the character card they have in front of them, and everybody's going to gain points as indicated by it. So for instance, if this card was revealed here, you gain points based on how many influence you have. If you have 5, you get 1, 10 is 3, and 15 is 6. So players would check their influence and see where they are. I want to point out that just because this is your card face down, doesn't mean you're the only one who scores it. Every player is going to score that card at that time. So at this time, whoever has the most points wins the game. Let's go into this sample playthrough. We know the orange player is going to go first because he's the first player marker here. So we're going to begin with the initial placement phase. So the orange player is going to go ahead and place on any available space on the board. So he's going to place here, then green's going to place down here, and blue decides to place up here. Now it's going to snake back, so it's going to begin with blue, and he's going to place anywhere he'd like to. He decides to go here, and then green will go up here, and so on. We're going to jump ahead to the end of this phase so you can see the beginning of the main game. Welcome back. The green player just placed. The blue player is about to make his final placement of the round. He's going to go ahead and place here. Now we fill the remaining spaces with the neutral player. So we can see a neutral guy goes here, here, and here. And with that, we're ready to start the main game. So the first phase of the turn is to reveal the activity cards. So we're going to reveal all the level 1 activity cards at this time. During the second round, we'll do the 2s, then the 3s, and so on. So we have new activity cards out on the board. Now we're going to move on to the income and salaries part of the turn. So everybody's going to get 10 money at this time, and they're going to have to pay money based on where they have guys. So we can see here, these guys cost nothing, but up here, orange is going to have to pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So orange just pays 5 to the bank, and green's going to have to pay 2, 4, 6, 7. So he pays 7 to the bank, while blue just pays 3. But with that, we're going to move on to assembling the workforce. So each player is going to grab the dice indicated by their people. So we can see the orange guy is going to get 3 white, a red, and a yellow, so he's going to roll them, and everybody else is going to do this at the same time and put them in their particular area of the district. Also, the neutral player is going to roll, so the first player can handle that as well and put it in the neutral player's district. So once everybody's rolled their dice, we're going to deal with some new event cards. Okay, so now we're always going to reveal the top red event card, but we can see here it also wants us to reveal a yellow event card. So we'll put that in that space and then reveal the yellow event card. Now we're going to resolve the events from left to right. So we know marauding happens, so we're going to add 1 black die. This happens, another black die, and then all players have to pay 3 money. Remember, if you ever cannot do what it says, you got to pay what you can, and then you lose 2 victory points. But everybody has enough money at this time, so they're going to pay that to the bank. Now they have to counter the black dice. So the first player is going to roll these, and then we got a 4 and a 5. So we know the first player is going to have to counter that 5, but may optionally counter that 4 as well. So the first player is orange. He has these dice here. So he's going to actually spend an influence to re-roll this dice. So he spends 1 influence, re-rolls it, and he got a 4. Remember, red are worth double, so in his mind that's now worth 8. He's just going to discard that and get rid of this 5. By getting rid of that 5, he gains 1 influence point, which he's going to take on this track here, and both of these are out. Remember, he could have also added the yellow die or a different die to make his total big enough to defeat both of them, but he decided not to do that at this time. So with that, the green player's next in turn order has to combat this 4, so the green player decides that he's going to go ahead and discard this 6 here. So he discards that 6, gets rid of that, but gains 1 influence for doing so. And with that, we're going to move on to the regular turns. Orange, of course, is going to go first. As his first action, the orange player decides he wants to construct the cathedral with all 3 of these dice. So he has a 4, 5, and 6, which means he's going to place one of his cubes in the lowest remaining space of the 4, 5, and 6. And now he immediately gets 3 victory points, 1 for each cube he placed, and he gets 6 influence. So he's going to move up 6 on the influence track. Now these are removed from play, and it's going to move on to the next player. You only take 1 action during your turn. So the green player now decides what he wants to do. For his action, the green player decides he wants to combat event cards. We can see this one here takes red dice, this one takes yellow, but he has a bunch of red here he'd like to use. So he's going to use these 3 reds. That's 9. Divided by 3 is 3. So he gets to put 3 cubes out on this card like so, and he immediately gains 3 influence, 1 for each cube for doing so. With that, we move on to the next guy's turn. This player decides he doesn't have quite enough guys in the yellow section yet, so he's going to go ahead and use this 1 yellow die. It's a 1, so that's this row here. But he doesn't have any guys to place, so he hires 1 by paying 2 influence. So he takes 1 from the general supply, and he places it in the row with the 1. So these guys slide over, and this neutral guy is knocked down. This returns the supply. It's back to the orange player's turn. The orange player decides blue has too many guys in yellow now, so he's going to use his yellow die, place a guy here. So that's going to knock these guys over, but as normal, he's going to have to hire 1 by paying 2 influence. So these guys slide over like so, and with that, it's the green player's turn. Now, even if the green player wanted to use this die to place in here, he couldn't, because he would knock another blue guy down. There's already 1 there. He could re-roll it and try something else, but he decides he's not going to do that at this time. He's just going to use this dice to get some agriculture here, but he thinks he's better off re-rolling it first. So green's going to spend 1 influence to re-roll that die, and he got another 2. He decides he's going to roll it again with another influence, and he got a 4. He's okay with that, so he's going to use it here as agriculture to get 2 money. With that, we're going to jump ahead a little bit later in the game so you can see some more interesting situations. Welcome back. It's getting near the end of the round. Both the orange and green player have passed. You can see they've passed because there's money in their respective areas. Now it's the blue player's turn. I also want to point out the green player did complete this event totally by himself, so he got all the points for himself, and this shifted over. But with that, it's the blue player's turn. He decides he wants to activate this card here. He does not have a guy on it yet, so that's going to cost 5 money. So he's going to pay 5 money, and he has to put a guy on it. He could hire 1, but he decides just to take this guy that's laying down over here and put him on the leftmost spot. Now he can activate it. He's going to use these 2 dice here. He'd love to also use this die, but it would cost him 6 money because it would be in a group of 3, and he only has 2. 8 divided by 4 is 2, so he's going to activate this card twice. And what this card does is he can pick either location and get as much money as guys he has there. So he'll pick the red location, so he gets 2 guys there times 2 money each. So that's 4 money per activation, so he's going to get 8 money with these dice. So he's going to put that there, take these, and now his turn is over. Now the orange player is going to gain a money because he doesn't get a turn because he passed, as does the green player. So now the blue player can take another turn. He decides he is going to go ahead and buy this die, so he pays 2 to the bank because it's a neutral player, and he's going to use it here as well. And 6 divided by 4 is 1, so he gets 1 activation, and again he has 2 guys there, and he gets 2 money per guy, so that's going to be 4 money that he picks up from the supply. Then both the orange player and the green player pick up another money because it would be their turn again, and then the blue player decides this time that he is going to pass. Now, because he passed and there's still dice out here, he also gets 2 money, but he's not going to get any additional for his turn being over. Remember, if there were no dice left, you do not get the money. So this time, everybody takes back their laying down guys. Of course, the neutral ones go back to the supply. So this guy's going to get 1 here, and this guy gets 1 here. Then everybody gets their money. This is going to pass over. We're going to play another round just like that. We'll come back closer to the end of the game so you can see the final situation. Welcome back. We just finished the 5th and final round of the game, so we're going to move on to final scoring at this time. So first thing in final scoring is everybody gets 1 point per event card they have a cube on, so we can see the green player gets 2 points, not points per cubes, but 2 because he's in 2 different cards. And the blue player gets 1 for marauding, so they would take those points from the supply. And after that, players are going to get points based on where their tradesmen are located. So we can see this guy here is worth 2, 1, 3, and 3 for green, and then you would take the points accordingly, and blue would score similarly with 2 here, 2 here, and so on. Next, players lose 2 points for each row of the cathedral they're not in. We can see orange has at least 1 guy in every row, so he's okay, but green and blue are both missing this first row, so they're both going to lose 2 victory points. And the final step will be all players reveal their character cards, and each character card has a scoring condition. For instance, this guy is number of tradesmen, so everybody will count out the number of tradesmen they have and see how many points they get. Everybody who has at least 2 tradesmen will get 1 point, 4 will get 3, and 6 will be worth 6. So we can see here the green player has 1, 2, 3, 4 tradesmen. So 4 tradesmen, he'll take 3 victory points. While the blue player has 1, 2, 3, 4. So he'll also score that. And the orange player has 1, 2, 3. So he'll only get the 1 victory point for this. So after all players have resolved their cards individually for all players' scores, remember your card doesn't just score you. Whoever has the most victory points wins.
Trois is a neat game in that despite all that dice rolling, it's not that random because you can buy dice from other players or from the neutral player, but you got to be careful when you're buying dice from other players because you're essentially giving them money. So you may or may not want to do that at certain times. Regarding new players, I do find they have a difficult time scoring points, and they don't really realize that till the end when all those cards are revealed. So it's helpful to go over the possible final scoring cards with them before the game begins. I strongly recommend doing that. Also, the new players have trouble with all the events because there's so many symbols and all these different cards and things. They have to constantly consult the player aids and things to figure out what they do. But there's only a few cards in the game, so once you've played it a couple times, that becomes second nature, and that's not a big deal. It is a really fun game. It's a nice strategic dice-based Euro, and it's nice to have a Euro with so much dice in it because I do enjoy rolling dice. There's also a beautiful implementation of this on Board Game Arena. I always recommend people to check out games there they're not sure about, or just these harder games, because it's really helpful online because there's always people there to help you, and it plays out the rules correctly in all cases. So if it looked neat to you, check it out. That's Trois.